Okay, hi. I am Debbie Cohen. I chair the Terry Lectures Committee as well as the Program in History of Science and Medicine here. Last year, the Terry Committee launched a new series, the Terry Forums, in order to bring together scholars and students from across the campus to reflect on questions about ethical knowledge making that cut across the disciplines. The forum is intended to be a space where we can learn from each other in a spirit of mutual respect for our differences. Our speaker today, I am delighted to say, is Charmaine Royal. As you can see here, she is the Robert Cahan Professor of African and African American Studies, Biology, Global Health, and Family Medicine and Community Health. And as she put it at lunch, she is all about interdisciplinarity, as that mouthful suggests. As I also learned at lunch today, Professor Royal grew up in Jamaica wanting to become a physician, came to the US for college to Howard University, and took her first genetics course and became fascinated by the subject. Though the questions that seemed most pressing to her, even back then, questions about the science's ethical framework and its entanglement with racism, didn't yet have a clear disciplinary home. And ever since, she has been at the forefront of crafting new methods and networks to pursue those questions. She went on to earn a master's degree in genetic counseling and a doctorate in human genetics from Howard, then completed postgraduate training in ethical, legal, and social implications research and bioethics at the National Human Genome Research Institute at the NIH, and in epidemiology and behavioral medicine back at Howard. And today she directs the Duke Center on Genomics, Race, Identity, and Difference, and the Duke Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Her research, scholarship, and teaching focus on ethical, social, scientific, and clinical implications of human genetics and genomics, particularly issues at the intersection of genetics and race. And she also serves on numerous national and international advisory boards and committees for government agencies, professional organizations, research initiatives, not-for-profit entities, and corporations. And as I've learned, has a very busy travel schedule, so we're very grateful to her for making time to visit New Haven. Our moderator today is Professor Brandon Ogbunu, who teaches in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology here, and is also a member of the Terry Committee. And he uses experimental evolution, mathematical modeling, and computational biology to better understand the underlying causes and consequences of disease across scales. And also writes frequently for non-academic audiences on a wide range of topics and with great wit. And you can find his articles in venues like Wired, Medium, and Scientific American. And I also want to acknowledge Professor Ogbunu and Professor Tom Neer as the co-organizers of the event today. Professor Neer is the chair of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. He's also the Bingham Oceanographic Curator of Ichthyology at the Peabody Museum and head of college at Saybrook College. And he mentioned to me that he was inspired to help organize this event because he grew up, quote, eyes wide open in the United States and is eager to include these topics in the biology curriculum here at Yale, in particular in the sequence of courses that every pre-med student and biology major takes in Yale College. So thank you to my co-organizers, and please join me in welcoming Professor Royal.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Brandon and Tom and all those who invited me here. I am delighted to be here. I was telling them that it's been a long time since I've been to Yale. My sister did her postgraduate work here in the 90s, and that probably was the last time I was at Yale. So it's great to be back. The ethics of knowledge making. I was fascinated by that. And I can't think of too many other topics where making knowledge requires us to think about the ethical issues related to the making of that knowledge. as race and racism. And today I'm going to talk about historical. We're going to do a little bit of history. I know I have a bunch of history of science people in here. I'm not going to get into the details, but just do a cursory overview of some of the key milestones in the creation of this idea of race and the racism that goes along with that. I'm going to present some data from some of my work on how people think about race. And I have developed an interest in looking at different groups, I don't want to call them stakeholder groups, different interest groups, and how they think about this. So I've looked at geneticists, anthropologists, general population, and clinicians, and I'm going to present some of those data in terms of how they think about this concept of race and apply it in their work. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about race-based medicine and some of the challenges with that. And I have some case studies. After talking about the perspectives of some of these groups, I'm going to do some case studies. I'm going to talk a bit about sickle cell disease, which is one of my areas of work, and then talk a bit about race-based medicine and some of the issues that are arising now in terms of how we do medicine, how we practice medicine, utilizing concepts of race and the questions about where do we go from here and how do we, and whether we not use race anymore. And then I'm going to wrap up. That sounds like 2 days of talks. I'm going to wrap up by talking a little bit about how I teach about race and racism and giving an example of a course that I call my signature course that I teach at Duke. That is a course that the students energize me, I hope, as much as I inspire them. So that's the frame for what we're going to do today. So when I think of history, one of the first people that come to my mind is John Hope Franklin, who was a professor at Duke. He also was a professor at Howard, which is where I got all my degrees, so we have a lot in common. He also loves orchids, and I'm an orchid connoisseur as well, so we have quite a bit in common. But in one of his most widely read books, From Slavery to Freedom, he made this statement: if the house is to be set in order, we cannot begin with the present. We must begin with the past. And so we're going to do a little bit of past, because the past is what informs how we deal with the present and the future. So I'm going to go through a few slides with, again, not an exhaustive history of race and the idea of race, but just some points that I think are relevant to what we're going to be talking about. So in terms of people thinking about, I guess I could take my mask off, can I? All right. That'll be better for you and for me. So in thinking about race and the creation of the idea, of course, as we know, race and racism has everything to do with people and how people see each other. So once people, and in this case, European, mostly explorers back in the 15th century and probably before, started engaging with people who looked differently from them. Those ideas of who are these people, why are they different, how are they different, started to percolate. So we have the European explorers, we have the start of the transatlantic slave trade, the movement of people across the Atlantic from different parts of Africa going to other parts of the world. And so those ideas started to percolate. But in the 18th century, we had scientists also doing their thing in their labs and wherever they did them, in their homes, wherever these ideas came from. We had Carlos Linnaeus, Mr. Taxonomy, who started grouping humans based on geography and came up with his 4-part grouping there. And then later on, we have Blumenbach, who many, not all, credit or discredit with the creation of this idea of race in terms of the hierarchies that we have. And so we have Blumenbach, his dissertation work, and then later publications, creating these categories and becoming one of the first. And there were other people doing this around that time, but he's one of the key ones in terms of creating this hierarchy based on what he viewed as the most beautiful people from the Caucasus Mountains, and putting one of the people who came up with the word Caucasian, and then putting everybody else below. And then we have Thomas Jefferson, third president of the US, being one of the first prominent US leaders to actually put forward this idea that people who we call Black people, people of African descent, are less than, are inferior to people who we call, in the US at least, who we call whites. So one of the first people to start using these, you see he talks about species and taking from the scientists' work and bringing it into how society starts to think about people and difference. Then we have the first census in 1790, and you may not be able to read this. I don't expect you to read all of it, but what I want you to see, this is created by the developed by the census in 2012, showing how categories, census categories have changed since the first census in 1790, where race was used in the census, and you see the categories there, and this shows how these categories have changed over time, right? Over time, they have changed. The one category in the census that has not changed, does anybody know which category has not really changed over all these years from 1790 to 2? I cut it off because it was too big, so you stopped there. But if you go to that website, it's an interactive resource. You can click on these and it gives you all the information. Click on any of these and you get more information. Click on the dates, you get more information about all of those identities. Does anybody know? Anybody can tell me? Somebody here. White has not changed. Who belongs to that group has changed, right? Who can be included and excluded has changed over time, but the category itself has not. All these other categories have changed, and you see where Chinese came in, mostly from immigration, right? We get a lot of information just from this graphic. And so the census, and I show the census, and I mention the census because the census is key to how we think about race, right? And when we look at the US Census today, the categories that we use in the census very much mirror Blumenbach box taxonomies, very much, right? Now we're saying we need to move away. We don't use Caucasian in the census anymore in the US, but we did, right? It was there. It's not there anymore. Different countries, as we know, have different censuses. And most of what I talk about today, because we don't have time to get into the global aspects of race, which could take us in some other directions. But over time, these have changed. But the census becomes important because we use it in research. We use those categories in research. We use it in we use them in clinical care. And the questions about why and how and whether we ought to use them are some of the big questions. And then we have Darwin, father of evolution, and his writings on the origin of species, and then Descent of Man. And in Descent of Man, he actually became one of the first people. And there are lots of things we could say about Darwin, and we're not going to talk a lot about Darwin today, but one of the first prominent scientists to question this notion of the existence of human races, right? Eugenics, half cousin of Darwin, Galton actually coined the term and brought that whole movement in, and Charles Davenport, who started the Eugenics Record Office here in the US in 1910 at Cold Springs Harbor. So eugenics became a thing, and people will argue that we still have eugenics today. Not so much argue, we still have it in all kinds of forms. So eugenics as a movement. And in the early 20th century to the mid 20th century, there was a series of debates among anthropologists and biologists, Montague and Kuhn and Brace and Livingston, and about just very similar to those debates we're having right now about race and the existence of race and ethnicity and what they are and what they're not and what biology says about them. And then we have Richard Lewontin from Harvard, who in the 1970s did studies looking at blood group antigens and looking at populations across the world. And there are all kinds of things we could say about those studies he did in the 70s, but his studies were some of the first ones to tell us a bit about genetic variation, biological variation, right, among populations, and told us that most of the genetic variation we see is within populations. About 85% or so of genetic variation can be found within populations, and very little variation between populations. And then the Human Genome Project that confirmed some of Lewontin's work and some of the previous work, that as humans, as a human species, we're more alike than we're different. 99.9% the same, we say, as humans. And around the time of the Human Genome Project, just before it ended and after, we had other scientists that were using different kinds of methods. Alan Templeton in the 90s and early 2000s used right statistic, which is a methodology of looking at genetic variation, right? And geneticists, population geneticists still use right statistic. And using that statistic as a measure of genetic variation, looking at variation within population, within individual groups, and then as a measure of, and looking at their in relation to the broader population, and looking at humans in relation to other organisms, and concluding that humans have very little variation within the group, genetic variation. So again, right statistic, less than 0.25. When you look across the human genome, we're saying probably about 0.156 in terms of this particular statistic, very low variation within the population. And the statistic used generally says, if the right statistic is below 0.25, then we can say humans don't have biological race. And when I say biological race, and I know that we have some evolutionary people in here, and there are all kinds of ideas and theories about how we think about race. And for some evolutionary biologists, race is synonymous with subspecies, which is a level of divergence below the level of the species. And when we look at humans, we don't see that level of divergence in terms of variation, right? And so using a biological measure, we can say humans don't have biological race, right? But what people often say is that biological race doesn't exist, right? And many in evolutionary biology will say it does, it just doesn't exist in humans, right? Many will say for some organisms, and if you look here, you'll say, and again, we could debate this, but many will say for some organisms, you could say they have biological race because of the amount of variation within those populations. But for humans, we don't. And there are other studies that talk about, that give us information about the origins of humans, and this one by John November and colleagues that confirmed studies that we'd already seen about the common origin, the African origin of humans. Again, confirming that we're one species, one origin, same people. We don't have biological variation that rises to the level of subspecies or the level of race. So we say there's no biological race in humans. And these are 4 criteria, and there may be more, some may add others to it. But these are 4 criteria that we often use in genetics and some other sciences to say that humans don't have biological race. We look at geographic variation. And when we look at populations globally, there's no place that we can say one population starts and the other one ends. Variation is overlapping, it's continuous, and they're not these discrete boundaries. Gene frequency, Lewontin showed us, and other studies have shown us more genetic variation within groups than between. Morphology, which is one of the big markers that we use to define race. And I'll talk about social race in a minute, but we use to define race. When we look at morphology, we see non-concordance. You know, what people call kinky hair doesn't necessarily go with dark skin, right? Or with a broad nose, or all these features that we tie to races. They're not obligatorily linked to each other or to disease, right? We can see people with blonde hair, blue eyes in Sierra Leone, or in the Solomon Islands, in other places from Europe, different from Europe. And then lineage, as I said before, no subspecies, no separate lineages within humans. It's one lineage, one species. So using these criteria, we say humans don't have biological race. Some people will say race does not exist, right? Race does not exist in humans, but that's not exactly true. We don't have biological race based on these data that I just presented. But social race exists because we've created it. It exists, and it has real implications on people's lives. The problem is that we conflate those two things, right? Which is the reason for the seminar today. It's like, what is race? Is it biological? Is it social? How do we distinguish those two things? And how do we resolve the complications that come from linking those two things? So saying biological race exists, but not in humans. Socially defined or socially constructed race is real. We've created it, and it has impacts on people's lives, including biological impacts and influences, right? So distinguishing those two things is critical as we think about race. What does biology say about race? What do humans have to say about what we've created that we call race, right? So I, as I said before, have become, as the more I study race, as the more I have become interested in getting real empirical data about what people think, and people who will use this information, people who are using and developing studies. And so some colleagues and I, colleagues at University of Washington, Mike Bamshed and others, did a study a few years ago looking at anthropologists and geneticists, anthropology professionals and genetics professionals. And we surveyed large numbers, and you see here where we started, who was invited, and then we got, for geneticists, we have 1,500. Anthropologists, we invited 4,000. We ended up with 3,000 and something, and then written comments. So I'm going to just show you some of the data that we got, and then some of the quantitative as well as qualitative. And we've published these studies. One of them is still in progress in terms of the quantitative study for geneticists. But I'm going to show you some data that compare the perspectives between geneticists and anthropologists. And I showed you those 4 criteria that we use to say race is, humans don't have biological race. But as we know in the field, and I'm a geneticist, I know within the field of human genetics, there is, even though we say there is consensus, there are differences of opinion. And these data showed us that. And so these are some of those data. So what we did, Mike Bamshed and I, we picked some statements that we call common statements. And these are statements that people make all the time, and they'll say, geneticists agree on this or don't agree on this. And these are some of these. Races don't exist. Race has no biological basis. Race is biologically meaningless, da, 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 da. As we asked this, and the surveys were the same for both the geneticists and the anthropologists, with just changing them accordingly in terms of when we asked them about their disciplines and all of that. That's the only part that was different in terms of demographics, but everything was the same. What do you notice, anybody? What do you notice when you look at these data? Exact opposite, right? They're flipped, right? I will say that most of the anthropologists were cultural anthropologists, which might not surprise us, right? The geneticists were mostly clinical geneticists and genetic counselors, but we had molecular geneticists, population geneticists as well. So that might have something to do with what we're seeing. But what we see here is exact opposite responses, right? All right. And I'm just going to show some of the qualitative data I may not be able to show. I have a bunch of quotes. This came from a geneticist. geneticists who say that race doesn't exist are in denial. Obviously, they have never looked at the results of an AIMS, Ancestry Informative Markers, that's what that is, panel on 1,000 African Americans and 1,000 European Caucasians. And clearly, the outmoded racial identifiers work more often than it fails. That's the science, regardless of anyone's opinion, right? As a geneticist. We asked the question, and this is something I've long been interested in, and I've actually written on this, that we should replace race. I've rethought that. I wrote that paper in 2006, and I have some thoughts about changing that. I still think we need to get rid of it, but I think some things I wrote in that paper I might have said differently. But the question of whether we need to do away with race and replace it with something else. So these were some of the questions we asked. And in general, you see that there's some agreement that we need to come up with something else apart from race, right? Well, as work has moved forward over the years, there are those who have been asking and wondering whether we're asking the right questions, right? We're asking, use race, don't use race, as if those are the only two options, right? There may be questions that we haven't asked. When should we use race? Why? How, right? Those are probably some of the questions that we need to ask instead of dichotomizing it the way we have. But I'm not quite there yet, but I'm getting there. So race is a four-letter word that needs to be retired and removed from the dictionary and common use. As an anthropologist and human geneticist, I have watched as modern methods of measuring variation in humans have made the word a 19th century anachronism with no scientific value. I'm going to jump over to some of these. The question of how we take this information to healthcare, based on how we think about race, the knowledge, the information we know that biological race does not exist, but we see these health differences. How do we reconcile those things? And then there was somebody who's just like, forget this human business. I just don't have to deal with this. Forgetting that they're part of society and they got to deal with it too, right? All right, so in thinking about looking at the general population, so we did a survey, colleagues at UNC, Chapel Hill, and myself and colleagues at Duke, did a survey, a national survey of the US population. We had about 1,700 people, a representative sample of the US population on race. And this was one question, one of my undergrads is working on this, looking at people's perceptions of the differences between race, ethnicity, and ancestry. And this is a qualitative question, open-ended question, and so we coded, and these are the responses we got in terms of the definitions of those words. Because as you know, these terms are used interchangeably, and we still are so confused about how we distinguish them, but that's not our conversation today. We're going to focus on race. But anybody can tell me quickly, what is one thing you notice on that, on that bar graph? One thing that strikes you on that. They are? That's right, yes. That is definitely one of the things that is striking in this, on this. Anybody else? Anything else? Uh-huh. Right. And what did most of them say they don't know? Ethnicity, right? Which we found interesting. Most people did not know how to define ethnicity. They could tell you something about race, whether it was correct or not. They could give you a definition for race. And when we asked them about their race, they could tell us something. When we asked people about their ethnicity, I don't know. They give you their race. Mostly Hispanic people would say, they use race and ethnicity. Many of the Hispanics in the study, they're the same thing. But most people, and even we did that in a pilot, and it's the same thing. Most people have no clue what ethnicity is, whether how to define it or what their ethnicity might be. And that's something we're following up on more. We also see that for genetic, and we could look at genetic and physical as similar, but for genetic, of course, race more likely, right? Most people are more likely to link race and genetics. When we asked the question about the existence of biological human races, this is what we saw. So we have gender, left, right, black, white. And what we see, and the line going across is the mean for all the other groups. I mean, blacks and white were our largest groups. The other groups were small, so we did them in terms of what they're showing us on these graphs. And we see that education, people with less education were more likely to think that whether they were men, identified as men or women, were more likely to think that biological races exist. We found that people who identified as white were more likely to think that biological races exist. We have a scale that we're in the process of validating, and we'd use this scale in this, and on that scale, looking at race and genetics, asking people various things about the relationship between race and genetics, and this is how they scored. And people who were black were more likely to score higher on that scale than people who identified as white. Younger people were more likely to score higher, which may not necessarily be very surprising. Yeah, those are some of the findings there. When we asked people for their comments, there are people who are thinking race needs to go, so much baggage. People who didn't even know what to say because there is so much that they could think of. Many people said they just never even thought about these differences and wanted to know more. And then, just like our other, it's complicated. It's complicated, and we know it's complicated. And it's this complexity that has led me to do some of the work I do. I've become very interested in complexity. And this is a model that colleagues and I developed and published in 2009. This is when I was at Howard. And this was part of an NIH grant we had. And what we did in this model is utilize data, mainly, most of the data were data related to African Americans, and looking at variables that influence health and interactions, and came up with this model looking at various domains in terms of, we looked at genetics, we looked at where people are, their identities, their social and environmental exposures, their psychological, where's my cursor is all over the place. But anyway, we looked at a range of variables here and their influences on outcomes, not just status of health, but drug response, health perceptions, a range of responses, informed by data that in that literature. And in that paper in 2009, we put out the idea, which is an idea I've had for a long time, about sickle cell disease and looking at sickle cell disease as a model to help us understand complexity, gene-environment interactions. Now, sickle cell disease, I'm going to just do a little bit for those who may not know about sickle cell disease. The first known publication, at least in the US, when I talk to my African colleagues, they're like, we've been talking about this thing for a long time, we just didn't know what to call it, right? And so we didn't have a journal to publish it in. And so we say 1910 was the first publication in the US on sickle cell disease, published by James Herrick, who identified the first person identified Walter Clement Noel in the US, in Chicago. He was a Grenadian dental student in Chicago, at University of Chicago, and became ill, and they found these elongated cells, and they were published. And over time, we've learned a lot about sickle cell disease. In 1949, Linus Pauling and others told us about the molecular basis of sickle cell disease. That is a point mutation in the hemoglobin gene. And you see here, this scheme shows what we call normal hemoglobin. We're careful about how we use these words normal, right? But we're just going to use it today. And then sickle, and it's one change, one base pair change in the genetic code from a T to an A that gives us a different amino acid from glutamic acid to valine. And the production of this different amino acid gives us hemoglobin S, which is a sickle hemoglobin, right? Normal hemoglobin, that one on the left, the red cells are pliable and soft, and they can slide through the vesicles, the small veins and capillaries. The sickled cells, however, become rigid because they've lost oxygen. The result of the variant produces a decrease in the amount of oxygen. Cells become sticky. They clump together, and going through cells, vesicles, capillaries, and veins cause a lot of pain. They cause blockage, what we call vaso-occlusion, which is part of the hallmark of the disease. We also learned in the 1950s from A.C. Allison about the link between sickle hemoglobin and malaria, right? And what you see here on the left is historically where malaria was, and on the right, sickle cell trait, right? Sickle cell trait. We also learned, I didn't say before, the inheritance of sickle cell disease is an autosomal recessive disorder. So both parents have to have a trait, and when they have a child, with every child that those parents have, if each of them has a trait, with every child there's a 25% chance that they could have a child with the disease. And it's the trait that is linked to malaria, right? And then when people have come together with a trait, then they could have a child with the disease. So the presence of sickle cell trait arose as part of natural selection to protect people from death from malaria. So classic case of natural selection. And here we see where malaria is today, still mostly in Africa and some parts of South America, but for most part of the world, it does not exist. Sickle cell disease is also probably the most racialized disease. There are other diseases that are racialized, but sickle cell disease has been. And this perception that sickle cell disease is a black disease has been part of the problem that people with the disease have in terms of their treatment. And part of my interest, I worked on sickle cell disease in my graduate work and as a genetic counselor at the Sickle Cell Center, and got more interested in disease as I saw families with children with sickle cell disease. And the children, I remember one family with 5 children affected with sickle cell disease. And each one of them was different in terms of their outcomes. One child was pretty much symptom-free. You wouldn't even know that they had sickle cell disease. And then another one in the hospital all the time. And then another one died early. And that variability struck me. And I thought there's got to be, and in grad school I learned about the genetic factors that influence that, but I was also interested in what are the other things. So the racialization of sickle cell disease is a big part of the story of the disease. We can't talk about it without the racialization. So sickle cell disease affects just about every organ. Every organ system is affected. And again, is affected in some people. Some people don't have a lot of symptoms, but most people will have some, from your eye all the way to your toes can be affected, as you see there. It's also global. There are about 20 million people globally with sickle cell disease. Most of them are in 3 countries, in the Congo, Republic of the Congo, Nigeria, and India. Most of them are in Africa, right? And we see the numbers there, and mostly countries below the Maghreb countries in Africa. And so we see sickle cell disease as a global disease. In the US, about 100,000 people with the disease. We see a lot of inequities in sickle cell disease. And many people don't think about the inequities and the disparities in sickle cell disease, because many people will say, well, we know it's, well, some people think of it as a black disease. Some people say, we know it's not a black disease, but mostly black people have it, which is true. Most of the people who identify as African, at least in the US, but the disease is also very common in Greece. There are some parts of Greece that have more sickle cell disease than some parts of Africa. South Africa, for example, doesn't really have sickle cell disease. Most of the people there are people who come from other parts of the continent. And so when we think about sickle cell disease, it's global. Turkey, Middle East, India, very, very much global. But in general, both here in the US and globally, has received little attention compared to other diseases in terms of funding and other things. And this is produced by the CDC Foundation, showing some of the disparities in terms of life expectancy, returning to the hospital. I talked about pain, the hallmark of the disease. More likely, even when you compare sickle cell disease with other diseases that have pain associated with them. There was a study done by colleagues at Hopkins looking at patients with long bone fracture. And what happens very often is that people with sickle cell disease, because they suffer from such severe pain, have to take narcotics for the most part to deal with the pain. And they're always in the ER for the most part. And very often, as we go down here, I'm not going to get to go through all of these, but patients are often seen as drug seeking. And in the US, as we said, most of the patients are patients who identify as African American. There are many patients who identify as Hispanic too with sickle cell disease. But that is one key component of sickle cell disease experience that people have. And I'm interested in knowing, do people across the world in other countries have that experience as I think about race and how it plays out? And then we also know that the number of physicians who are willing to see people with sickle cell disease is also a small number. Some people just don't want to deal with them. Now, in thinking about factors that influence sickle cell disease, we've long known that there are genetic factors. It's a classic Mendelian single gene disorder, right? You can't get it unless you inherit those variants from both of your parents. And so there are these genetic factors, the hemoglobin genotype, whether you're SS, there are over 1,000 hemoglobin variants. S is the most severe and the one we talk about here, but there's C as well, and S with another abnormal hemoglobin will result in sickle cell disease. But the genotype, the haplotype, and all these are genetic factors. But less well known are non-genetic factors that influence sickle cell disease, and these are some of them. Climate, all aspects of climate, and I'm going to try to wrap up soon, that influence sickle cell disease, but all of these. And there are studies that have looked at these at these factors, and this is a paper published by PL and others from the UK, where they created this image of some of the genetic modifiers, the non-genetic modifiers. But what I found interesting in their paper is that they never brought them together, right? So we're looking at the genetic modifiers up here. We're looking at the environmental modifiers down here. I have long been interested in bringing all of those things together, and this is an image from a paper that we published last year that has 7 domains. And as you notice, there are no boundaries between those, because what we know is that all of these things are operating together at the same time, and understanding that complexity. It's challenging, but it's a must if we really want to understand the mechanisms of the disease. And so the paper we published put forward this idea of looking at sickle cell disease. And we used pain as an example. All of what you see there is informed by the literature. The arrows are factors that exacerbate pain. The circles are factors that have been shown to ameliorate pain. So as we think about health and disease and race and racism, thinking about not just factors that cause disease or make disease worse, but also factors that can help have a positive impact on our health and outcomes. Both are equally important. And this was a timeline we created looking at various factors as they go up and down. The pain is going up, going down as different factors, the factors from these domains, and how people's health is increasing as their pain decreases. And so this work, in terms of looking at the complexity, and I'm going to move on because I know I've got to wrap up soon, is something that we've done we just did a preliminary study looking at people with sickle cell disease in Jamaica, Cameroon, and South Africa. And well, we did South Africa too, but this publication was focused on Jamaica, Cameroon, and the US. And for various reasons, we couldn't do the comparisons. We were looking at existing data. We wanted to look at gene-environment interactions, but for all kinds of reasons, some sites didn't have genetic information, some didn't have environmental, so we just picked one that had the most robust set of data, and that was Jamaica. And what we found associations in terms of age, in terms of atmospheric temperature, rainfall, zinc, lower zinc was a risk factor for pain, and greater poverty. So these were some factors that we found that influenced severity of pain or increased severity of pain. We were surprised not to find any differences across genotypes, because the genotypes are known to be factors that influence severity. So there might be some things that we need to look at there. I'm going to move very quickly into talking about race-based medicine. And what you saw there was just the assumptions that underlie race-based medicine, right? And race-based medicine, when I say race-based medicine, I'm thinking about practicing medicine based on these racial categories, how we treat people, the drugs that we give them, the treatments that we give them, and the things that we think will work best for them in terms of their health. And the assumptions are that races exist, and that biological races exist, that they differ in their genetic components, and that these differences influence those health outcomes. So I'm going to talk very quickly about Bidil, which is a drug, the first drug approved by the FDA to treat a specific racial group. Has everybody in here heard about Bidil? Some people have. Anybody never heard about Bidil? Oh, we have some people who never heard about Bidil. Okay, we're going to take a couple of minutes, just a couple, because I don't want to take away from you. I can't talk about Bidil in a couple of minutes, but I'm going to try to do it. So Bidil is a combination of two generic drugs, isosorbide dinitrate and hydralazine hydrochloride. These are two generic drugs that have been used by cardiologists over the years, since the 1970s or before, to treat heart failure. And they've used these two generic drugs in different combinations to treat people with heart failure. And when I say treat people, black, white, yellow, green, blue people, right? Everybody, they use them, and they used it in different combinations to treat different people. In the 1970s, a researcher at University of Minnesota, he's a clinician, Jay Kahn, started putting these two drugs together in particular combinations. And over time, he sold the rights to that to a company called Nitromed, got a patent on it, and it's a long story. They got 3 patents on it. They applied to the FDA in the 80s to get it approved to treat heart failure in blacks, because some study that they had done had shown that it works better in black people than other people. And they thought, okay, we need to get the FDA to approve this for us to treat black people. Applied to the FDA in 96, the FDA turned them down and said, no, you need to go do a study that will show that it works better for black people than other people. So they designed the study called the AHEF, African American Heart Failure Trial. And the trial started in 2001. And in 2003, they discontinued the trial. There was a placebo trial, so there were half of the people, 1,050 people were in this study. Half of them got placebo and standard treatment, and the standard treatment was either ACE inhibitors or diuretics, right? So they got a placebo and standard, and the other half got standard and Bidil, right? And so in 2003, they ended the trial because the group that was getting Bidil, when they compared the two, the group that was getting Bidil had a reduction of death from heart failure of 43%. Big percentage, right? So they had to end it because it would have been unethical to continue. So they ended the trial, 2003. At that time, sought to get another patent. They did get another patent. They had three patents. That the whole patent story is a whole big story. Jonathan Cahn, who's probably written the most on this, has actually written a book on Bidil. So you can look him up, Jonathan Cahn, if you want to learn more about that. But the interesting thing about Bidil, one of the interesting things about Bidil is that, as I said before, it's the first drug ever to be approved by the FDA for a particular racial group. The company, Nitromed, once in 2005, it was approved by the FDA. In 2008, the company went out of business, and a couple other companies bought it. It's now owned by a company called Arbor Pharmaceuticals, which is where this came from, on their website. So they're still marketing the drug. There are a couple of people we don't have a ton of data. My team and I have done some empirical studies on physicians' use of Bidil. This is a study we did with cardiologists. But there are really not many studies on Bidil and trying to understand why it failed so early, right? The NAACP, the Congressional Black Caucus, the Association of Black Cardiologists all supported this at the time. Now I talked to many of them, and many of them didn't know that this was what the company was going for, to get it approved to treat a specific racial group. I testified at the hearing for the approval. My colleagues and I at Howard, I was at Howard at the time, and we were, black folks over on this side said, do not approve this drug just for black people. And then we had the Congressional Black Caucus over there and said, we've been discriminated against, give us our drug, it's our time. We gotta address health disparities, right? Very, very interesting hearing. The FDA ended up approving it. This was a study that we had done. There's so much I could say about this, but we don't have time. These are some findings from a study we did, some colleagues and I did in 2019. We just published another paper with some findings that were similar. But what we found is that some cardiologists are still using Bidil, but for most of them, they give it to anybody for whom it will work. It's approved just for self-identified blacks. That's what the indication says, right? And so people are approving it off-label, are prescribing it off-label to other people for whom it works, as we see there, not only given to black patients. And for many of them, the primary criterion was not race in terms of why they prescribed it. It was the indication, what else was going on with that person in terms of their health. And then there are some that believe that it was appropriate to do that, for the FDA to do that, and others that thought. Bottom line is, lots of questions among physicians even about Bidil and whether this should have been done, but it's been done. It's still the only case for which this has been done. Lots of issues there. And we may talk about some of them later, about why the FDA saw it fit to do this for this drug and not for other drugs, right? For other studies where there were no black people over the years, right? And so their thing was that this study was just done with black people, and so it can only be approved for black people. Well, studies a long time ago didn't include any black people, and we get all those drugs that all of us are using, right? And so why is it different? So lots and lots of issues there. And this was from that same study, that our doctor said to us that my white patients would walk in and say, give me that black drug, it's working for me. Patients don't, they just want to know what's working for them, right? So we put these labels on these things, and many people don't really care. So in terms of race-based medicine, the paper that colleagues and I wrote about precision medicine, there's all this talk about precision medicine. And we wrote this paper, it was really a question, and we talked in that paper, used some examples, but also talked about what it would take for us to move beyond race and whether we can even do that. Then some colleagues, the same year, wrote a piece on taking race out of human genetics studies. And that's been a big conversation about whether genetic and genomic studies should be even using the concept of race. And then we had this study that was published a little later last year, where some geneticists and others are saying, hold up a minute, not so quick with getting rid of race. There may be some utility to this. And these are geneticists, and they gave some studies about how race, even more than genetic ancestry in some cases, was predictive of health outcomes. So there continues to be the debate about this and whether we use this in genetic studies. And I co-chair a National Academies committee that is looking at this very issues about use of race and other such descriptors in genetic studies. I'm going to move on quickly because I know I want to do the Q&A and we are past time. This slide and the next couple of slides are really just about where we are in the conversations. So there's been a lot of conversations recently since 2020 and the death of George Floyd and a lot of things that have been happening about how we use race in medicine and about algorithms. You've heard about the EGFR and how these algorithms are used to determine who gets what treatments, right? And that these algorithms are based on ideas about race. So EGFR, the estimated glomerular filtration rate, and this algorithm that has been used to give different treatments to Black patients from white patients because of the long-standing perception that Black patients have more muscle mass than white patients, and so they excrete more creatinine. So you look at a level of creatinine and you have to adjust your algorithm because Black people have more muscle mass, right? So these ideas, long-standing, but they influence what we do today. So wrapping up, I really am wrapping up now. Where do we go from here? I presented a lot of issues, a lot of problems. And I have here what I call the biomedical ecosystem, as all of the entities, and these may not be all, but some of the key ones, that have to be involved in any efforts to change what I've been talking about this whole time, to change how we use race in society, in health research, in clinical practice. It takes more than just the geneticists or the social scientists, bringing us back to our conversation about how we think about knowledge and making knowledge, and how we make ethical knowledge, right? It has to be informed by multiple voices for us to think through all of the issues. And one of the areas that I am going to talk about just really quickly is the area of training. There's a course that I teach at Duke called Race, Genomics, and Society, where I bring all of these things together, bringing genetics, and I do a primer on genetics and talk about how genetics influences and how people think about athletics and intelligence and skin color, and help them understand how these things come to be, and what genetics says or not, and how society says about these things, and then talking about health. And this fall, I'm always doing different things with this class. And this fall, last fall, I had the experience of a lifetime where I asked the students, and I've capped that course at 100 students. So this fall, we had 96 students, 98 started and 96 took the class. And one of their assignments was to create a piece of art at the end of the class, throughout the class, but a piece of art that represented what they took away. And it had to be a piece of art that brought together the genetics and the social and all of the factors, right? And they could focus on one module, say skin color, or they could do a combination, ancestry testing, skin color, intelligence, whatever. And the students they had an 8.5, 11. I worked with people in my arts department, and it's 4 discussion sections, and they created these art, and these are the four panels. And I can't tell, and each of them had to write a 150-word statement that described their piece. It is now on display in our Rubinstein Art Center, which is our big art center at Duke. And I can't tell you what it means for me to see what they wrote, not because it says anything about me, but because it tells me about the future. It gives me hope for the future, and how these students took this information in, and how it informs how they think about race and racism and what they will do in the future. So I could talk forever about that. I sat and I read all of these, and I'm thinking, did they really get this from this? Fascinating, fascinating. And then some of them would say, I'm no artist. But when you see what they created, I said, it was just great. I'm going to end with a slide by a colleague of mine, building on how we teach about race and genetics. Because for me, how we communicate the information, and I say we, I'm talking about faculty in the academy and others who teach, and how we help people understand social race and biological race, and the difference between the two, and what happens when we conflate the two, right? And teaching people so they understand. And so teaching about this has been one of my life mission. And a colleague of mine, Brian Donovan, who works in Colorado at the Biological Sciences Curriculum Study, or he's a research scientist there, they work primarily with K through 12. And when I finish my Race, Genomics, and Society class, we always do a so what at the end of the class. And invariably students say, this information needs to be taught earlier, right? I didn't learn this until I got here. And Brian and his team they've been doing studies and have done studies that show that how we teach And I talked about Mendelian disorders and how we teach about Mendelian disorders and how we teach about the presence and absence of genes and how that leads to an outcome. And needing to teach about complexity, right? How we teach students at all levels influences, and they've done randomized trials that show that students who learn about complexity have different ideas about the relationships between people, about what people are capable of and what genetic differences mean or don't mean. And he and I collaborating on some, getting ready to collaborate on some things. So thinking of the ethics of knowledge making toward a more humane genetics, how we think about justice, how we think about beneficence and non-maleficence in our teaching about race and genetics and how those things come together, leading us to a more humane genetics and a more humane way of thinking about the relationships between these things, but a more humane way of living with one another. I'm going to stop there. Thank you. All right, Brandon, I know I've taken all your time.
Keep talking as far as I'm concerned, please. No. Well, thank you, Professor Royal, for that. I wanted to remind everyone there's a reception. We'll go until about 5:30, and then there is a reception afterwards, right outside. So we'll upstairs. Great, thank you. Great.
Water,
yes, you can get as much water as you want.
Thank you all for your patience. I know I went on and on there.
No.
All right.
Thank you, take the time. Well, thank you for that. Again, thank you to the co-organizers. Thank you, Professors Cohen and Neer. Really, really enjoy. And obviously, thank you, Professor Royal, for solving the problem of scientific racism for us over the last hour. Really quite thrilling. And I think there's so much in there. There's so many directions to take. And I think you did a beautiful job kind of communicating not just the topic, but the topic through your work, which I think was really quite impressive, how you've been able to address it. We're going to start with something invariably you've thought about with regards to the way that we address this problem in contemporary settings. There's this notion that we're just going to add more data to the problem and we will solve it. We sequence more genomes and more genomes and more genomes, or perhaps a little more charitably, we get more diverse genomes from more diverse backgrounds. And I think if we understand more and more genomes, we'll kind of solve the problem that way. And obviously some people who, one respects even take that approach. You know, maybe even are thinking about the problem in a humane way as you would articulate it. I want you to respond to that. And what is your take on that approach to these problems?
Okay. So Brian, which mic am I using? Not the lavender, this one, right?
Yeah.
All right, so I can take this one out. Okay, so to answer your question, Brandon, I think there are some cases where we might need more data. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't say we need more genomic data. I would say we need more of the other data, right? But we need more genomic data on some things. There's some things where, and when I say some things, there's some issues where we don't need any more data. We don't need any more data, I think, and some will argue with me, to tell us that humans don't have biological race. Right? I mean, there are people who say, well, what if because we often say humans are a young species, so we don't, we haven't lived long enough to have it. And people say, well, what if we look for 1 million years from now? Well, we might have some biological race. I'm like, we'll think about that then. Right now, we don't have it. So in terms of that issue and how we understand human genetic variation and human variation, there's a lot we can understand about human still to be understood with regard to human variation. But with regard to the issue of race, I think we have the information we need right now. The information that tells us about our common human origin, the information that tells us about frequency and all, I think we have enough to drive home those messages to people who don't know. I'm not naive enough to think, and even in teaching race genomics in society, I'm not naive enough to think that just giving people that information is going to take care of the racism problem, right? It's not in and of itself is going to take care of the racism, but it has a role to play. In our national survey that I showed you, 54% of the US population believe that they're biological races. What they understand by biological races, we didn't get into that, but we will. But the ideas that surround that knowledge are important, right? And so helping people understand how we're related to each other as humans is important, is still important. But we have a lot more work to do in society. But I think it's going to take the geneticists and the social scientists and all of us working together to solve the racism problem. Collecting more genetic data and genomic data can tell us something. But I think in the end, we need to collect more data on the context within which genes operate, right? To help us understand this complexity. And context broadly defined, not just what we eat, but the racism that affects us and influences our health and help us understand how those stressors interact with genetic or other factors to influence us. That complexity we don't understand fully, and we're not even close to understanding it. So in that case, for that, I think we need more data.
You know, fascinating. Thank you for that. I'm going to jump around a little bit, if that's okay. And I think you set the precedent for that with the way you were able to elegantly tie so many parts of this conversation together. I think you talked about testifying in the for the Biden trial kind of decision, and you outlined this setting where you and your colleagues were, you know, articulating these points about the problems with approving Biden, and you were in opposition to these lawmakers, black lawmakers, the Congressional Black Caucus, who were in favor. And I think that's a kind of a good microcosm for the way these kind of conversations happen, where there is a kind of a social justice component to this desire to reify race. And I want to hear it now. I want to now take you to your classroom, where invariably you're able to teach this effectively. So I want to know how you were able to, I know how you think about it because you just told us how you think about it and how you reconcile that. But how are you able to communicate, to reconcile that conflict with a lot of people? Because it's one that is a barrier, I think, to the country understanding in this complexity.
That's a really good question, Brandon. You know, I have talked with my colleagues in the CBC and at the NAACP about their, myopic way of looking at this. Of course, they have an agenda that's in some ways different from mine, right? And their agenda is to ensure that the policies that are put in place in their minds benefit Black people, right? When I talk to them, they understand the scientific racism argument that we were trying to make, right? That approving this drug just for Black people is sending the message that many already believe, that Black people are different biologically and need their own drug, right? And so I had them think about that. And for them, it's like, we know that, but we still need some attention.
Oh, interesting.
Right? It's like it's a tough one, but it requires those kinds of conversations to get us across the divides, right? When I talk to them about their roles in the community and how they need to think about the roles that they play in reifying these notions, and how the people within the Black community, I use that term in quotes, look up to them to protect their interests. And if their interests, at least in my view, are not informed, are not looking at the big picture, right? In their minds, they're looking at the big picture, which is social justice. I'm like, I'm looking at social justice too, but we need to figure it out. The thing is that if it's approved for everyone, Black people will get it too, hopefully, right?
You're right.
But
That's a different problem.
I'll get it too. But see, when I think about justice and social justice, I think about justice for everybody. So I think about the Hispanic people who won't get it because it's just approved for black people. But the other issue is that it's not gonna work for every black person, as we saw in the trial. So what about those people who are black who won't respond well to Bidil? Will they get a drug, right? So once we go down this path, it may look like it's serving a purpose and doing what they think it's going to do, but the downsides to not just people who identify as black, and they're thinking that, okay, we've given them their drug, we don't have to try to find another one that might work for them. Now, how Bidil has played out in terms of Arbor Pharmaceuticals is, the company's marketing it, doctors are still prescribing it. Many black people are not taking it, right? I remember in 2005 when it was approved, in 2006, and I would talk to people. I was talking to this man who, he was the uncle of a friend of mine, and she said, you need to talk to my uncle because he won't take Bidil. And I said, and he has heart failure. And I talked to him, I said, so why won't you take the drug? He's like, they developed that just for us?
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, I'm not gonna take it, right? Yep. And so we think and for many people, that's probably why the drug didn't survive. And also the drug, there's so many stories, many doctors were not prescribing it for their patients because it was too expensive for their black patients, right? And so there's so many issues that surround, it's the first drug that's done that this has happened to. So it's the only example we have. And we haven't done enough research to really understand all the facets of what is happening with Bidil. And so I think it requires conversation. I've had conversations with my colleagues at the CBC and at the NAACP about this. And over time, I mean, they got upset because the price of the drug was so high. The drug had the highest markup of any FDA-approved, 700% after it was approved by the FDA, 700%. And going into this, people were worried and were saying to NitroMed, you sure this is, black people, if you say different for black people and many people who not able to afford it, you need to make it affordable. And say, oh, it's gonna be affordable. Well, it was not, right? And so the cost became an issue. And so I think when we think about how these things play out, we have to have a broad view of things and prioritize, figure out what's really important.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, really, really important. I mean, because every time there's a lot of big public hiccups around talking about race. David Reich they always use disease, right? These types of things about how, and I think the way you've been able to disentangle that is really profound. I'll ask one last question, and then I'll take questions from the audience while we have a few minutes. I want to go to sickle cell anemia. I think your work there was my introduction to your work. And I think what's beautiful about it, and certainly Professor Neer, right, I think we teach that as the canonical Mendelian disease, right? And I think we have these other models of genetics where everything else is more complex, but sickle cell is very, very, very simple. And I think what your work has done is blown that open and articulated that even that one. Now I think to myself, wow, is Mendelian disease even a proper term for things, right? Maybe we need an entire new lexicon to describe genetics as a whole. So you're succeeding in making all of our jobs more difficult. So I want you to lean into that. And are there other diseases you talk about? This is not the only racialized disease, right? As you say, maybe the most, but kind of lean into that a little bit. And what are some other kind of thoughts you have in that direction, or other diseases of that kind?
Okay, so good question. So there's cystic fibrosis, which is also racialized, but not in the same way, right? But very similarly, black people who have cystic fibrosis, they're misdiagnosed, just like white people who have sickle cell disease are misdiagnosed, right? And misdiagnosis, as we know, it can be a major problem. But cystic fibrosis has the same kind of a complexity, smoke exposure and da-da-da. I just published a paper, well, it was published last year as well, with colleagues at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, looking at sickle cell disease, cystic fibrosis, Huntington disease, and Parkinson's disease as 4 monogenic diseases. I mean, Parkinson's is, you know, a little more variable in terms of inheritance, and looking at environmental factors. So the paper was on environmental influences on Mendelian diseases, and for us to start thinking about Mendelian diseases differently. But your point about whether Mendelian is even a way of thinking about it, I mean, I guess we could say Mendelian, but probably not monogenic, right? Because Mendelian still helps us predict inheritance, right? And that's really the pattern,
Sure.
is the patterns of inheritance. So the patterns are still there in terms of how you get it, because you can't get it, these diseases without. I mean, Parkinson's, again, is a little different. But Huntington and sickle cell and CF, you can't, at least right now, as far as we know, you can only get it by inheriting those variants. So how we think about disease and health, right? Somebody who has 2 S hemoglobins, but have no symptoms, have no complication, they're pretty much fine. Do we say they have sickle cell disease? Do we say they have a disease? Well, you know, we may or may not, right? And how we think about health and disease, all of those questions are part of this issue of complexity and how we understand complexity. And the more we look at, so my thing has always been all diseases are complex, right? All diseases are complex. They don't just happen. They're multifactorial, all of them, right? Some may be a little more complex than others, or some we may be able to predict their inheritance a little bit better than other diseases. I mean, we know most breast cancers are sporadic, but about 10%, and prostate cancer are hereditary, right? And so thinking about diseases, all of them as being complex, and the levels of complexity, right? For the Mendelian disorders or monogenic disorders, the environmental and social factors may play a lesser, not as prominent a role in their etiology, but in the pathophysiology, they play a major role. And the more we understand those things, the better we are able to. I mean, the sickle cell disease is also the thing at the top of the list for gene editing.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
And my thing is that even when we think about who's going to respond well to curative therapies, we need to think about these other factors. It's not just plugging in a gene here and everything is going to be fine, right? So.
Yeah, no, so much. Great. No, thank you for that. We have a few minutes left, so we'll take a question or 2 if we can from the audience. I think, no. We have a question.
Mm-hmm. Very good question. What I would say, and I did not talk about racism as much, but I always say there's no race without racism. Racism created race, right? And racism is what brings this hierarchy, right? And these ideas about inferiority and superiority that drove the creation of race, right? So we had these ideas about who was most beautiful, we, Blumenbach, whomever, about who was most beautiful, and then we created something to justify those ideas. So racism and race to me are intertwined. They're not separate. They're not separable. And you're right. I think in many cases we talk about race as a category without talking about the racism that goes along with it. And I guess I did some of that today, talking about race and not so much the racism. But for me, they're all part of. When I talk about sickle cell disease and how people are treated in the clinic, it's because they're racialized that they're treated in a particular way, and so they're one and the same to me. And so if we say race is a social construct, it's so. And I hesitate to use. I rarely say that race is a social construct as opposed to saying it's socially constructed, right? We made it up, right? And using it as a verb as opposed to a noun puts the onus on who created it, on the creation. So I agree with you that the racism is what we need to address. And the racism is what, to address the racism, in my view, will take us coming together and getting beyond the separation that has caused these divides, and helping us, as I say very often, is to see ourselves in the face of the other and to interact more with each other.
Any other questions from the audience?
Talk so much, you have no questions. Sorry about
No,
that.
I think there's one. Let's see if we can.
Well, there are a couple of short but related questions. I think there's a theme, whether it's in the case of viral, but also in earlier parts that relate to the genetics or genetics and race. So it relates to the idea of either cherry picking data or the reliance of quote unquote incomplete data. So viral results started to change as more data
Yep.
were collected. But also there are the recent genetic studies in the last 2 years or so when more data have been collected, even the tools that were designed to separate based on categories couldn't separate anymore. And there are all of those spectrums with more data. And that was something that was theorized for a long time, but the availability of data kind of pushed against any kind of segregation between categories. But then there was this article that was written by no one other than Richard Dawkins, who was like writing that it's not that race doesn't exist, but race is a spectrum. But then the title would suggest that race is a spectrum, but biological sex is binary. And it sounded like, we gave you that method. We're not going to give you the other one. So my questions are, one, to what extent do you think that conversation about racial categories relate to other debates, be it about biological sex or other similar debates? Two, based on the surveys you presented to us in the first part and your experience, where do you see the use of race of genetics heading in the next 5 or 10 years? We don't talk about much of the long term. The second one, I know it's a bit of an open-ended question, but I'd like to know your opinion about it.
Okay. So I think that the conversations about race and racism and the conversations about gender and sex, there are some similarities in those conversations in terms of utilizing biology as a marker of difference. Now, but they're different in terms of how we use that. I mean, I know researchers who study homosexuality, for example, and who identify as gay, and their work is intended to show that this is a biological trait, right? Race is different, right? For race, we're trying to show that what we're calling race and racism is socially constructed, so biology is not the driver of those differences. So there are differences in those conversations and in the underlying science of those conversations. There's also a difference with race, in my view, and I don't apologize for this. I think there's something different about race from gender, from sexuality, and any of those other identities. I know about intersectionality as well, but if we focus on race and we can address race, then in my view, we can address everything else. If we don't single race out and address it, or at least try to address it, it constantly gets subsumed on all these other things and never really gets the attention it needs. And race, this country, and parts of the world too, is built on that idea. It is built on that separation. And so there is an urgent need to address race like no other identity, in my view. And so that's my perspective on race and racism in light of these other isms that we're trying to address. The issue of I'm blanking on the other question now. All right, so I will say very quickly that I can't say a whole lot about that because I'm on this National Academies committee that's looking at that, and we can't say much of people here have been on National Academies.
Come on.
You're vowed to secrecy. So we're beginning that work. But I can say that, and the committee is comprised of social scientists, epidemiologists, historians, geneticists, and others. I think in the next 10 years, we will see, at least I hope, we will see a shift in how genetic studies are done in light of what we know about race. And I think if we see a shift in genetic studies, that will inform what happens in biomedical research writ large. I think genetics and the role that genetics plays in the creation of race and the maintenance of this notion of race, I think if genetics and geneticists and genomicists change the way they do research, and when I say change, I'm talking about everything from, whether we use race or not, but how we think about the role of genes in outcomes, health outcomes, traits, whatever the outcomes are. How geneticists think about and design their studies, I think will inform what other disciplines do. And I think a change is on the horizon. I hope it is.
Great. Well, join me in congratulating, thanking Professor Royal. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Head out of the auditorium here, turn to the left. There's a stairwell that is like centrally located right over here.
I have so much to talk to you about. Please be my friend.